All right, everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off, we were on the end of the war, basically, of the third year. I meant not the war. End of the third year of the war, and the changing of the Russian and German fronts here. We're now on to this big block of text, and this is why I was kind of trying to... Well, the last video was maybe a little bit longer than usual, because this one I got to try to get through in relatively quickly, so you guys aren't just staring at a block of text for the whole time. But we're now on to the fourth year. Since July 1942, the British 8th Army and Rommel's Afrika Korps had been quiescent on the El Alamein line. On October 23rd, the British, now commanded by General Sir Bernard L. Montgomery, I don't know why I keep getting that name mixed up, unleashed the great drive that was to right the Finnish to Axis hopes for domination of North Africa and the conquest of Egypt. Bolstered by troop reinforcements, new American tanks, and a protective aircraft umbrella, the British began a 10-day pounding on the German emplacements that resulted in a breakthrough on November 3rd. By November 7th, Rommel was in full retreat 240 miles west of El Alamein, pushing westward at a rate that had the British hard-pressed to keep within striking distance of him. Tobruk fell on November 13th, then Benghazi November 21st. In mid-January 1943, the 8th Army was within 100 miles of Tripoli, where the Afrika Korps was expected to make a stand. But on January 24th, Rommel gave up Tripoli and led his weary troops into Tunisia, where he took temporary sanctuary behind the Marneth line. In 15 weeks, Montgomery's men had performed the phenomenal military feat of advancing more than 1,500 miles. North Africa landings. Allied strategy in North Africa became apparent on November 8th, 1942, when a convoy of 850 Allied warships and troop transports arrived at several ports in Morocco and Algeria. American soldiers, in their first big operation in the European theater, swarmed ashore at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. A successful political conquest had paved the way for the invasion, the initial objectives of which were accomplished with little bloodshed. Algiers fell by nightfall on the first day, Oran on November 10th, and Casablanca a day later. Admiral Jean Darlin, the former Axis collaborator, then ordered an end to resistance, and all Morocco and Algeria passed under Allied control. The plan of the battle that became evident was to strike at the Axis western flank while Montgomery was pressing from the east. From Sicily, the Germans began pouring heavy reinforcements into Tunisia, where it became obvious that they would have to make their last stand in North Africa. American and British troops began driving into Tunisia a few days after the final landings. Development in France. In France, Funny Mustache Man's response to the North African landings was an immediate occupation of the entire country with the single exception of Toulon area. The bulk of the French Navy was anchored in Toulon, and Funny Mustache Man's discretion was interpreted as an invitation to the fleet commanders to turn over their vessels to the Reich. On November 27th, apparently impatient of the French failure to cooperate, Funny Mustache Man ordered Toulon taken and the fleet seized. The French officers promptly scuttled about 60 ships, and a few that were still seaworthy escaped to join the Allies. 1 second here. Just have to... There we go. Stalingrad. The Soviet theater was being dominated by the exhaustive efforts of the Germans to take Stalingrad, and the heroic Soviets defense of that city. By September 1st, 1942, Stalingrad was under siege, German troops having established a foothold on the west bank of the Volga River. In a few weeks, they were within the city, engaged in street-to-street fighting with the Soviet forces. In early October, the German High Command virtually admitted the failure of their assault by announcing that it would depend on heavy artillery to level the city. By the end of the month, the Red Army had started a counter-move against the rapid tiring enemy. Picked units gradually encircled Stalingrad in preparation for the drive which later cut off the German army. On November 22nd, the big Russian offensive was underway on 3 sectors of the long front. From Rashev, a drive was made towards Veliki Luki, and from Vornezev, another spearhead was directed at Kharkov. In the Stalingrad area, a flanking movement was begun, which, by January 10th, 1943, had cut off the retreat of 330,000 Germans and placed them under siege within the city. On February 2nd, the Soviet command announced the surrender of the German garrison and the end of one of the bloodiest battles in history. A few hundred miles south, the Soviets were mopping up the Germans in the Caucasus area. During the summer of 1942, the invaders had penetrated as far as Nalchik and Gerchevsk. The Soviets occupied Georgivsk on January 11th and then pressed towards the Sea of Azov. By February 8th, the Red Army had taken most of the key cities on this body of water and were closing in on Rostov. Guadalcanal. Since August 7th, 1942, American Marines had been struggling to maintain their grip on the tropical jungles of Guadalcanal, while of a minor character from the standpoint of numbers involved, the battle for the Solomons was important in that the safety of the Allied supply lines to Australia were at stake. Also, an American victory was necessary to ensure the success of further operations against the Japanese Pacific outposts. The fate of the Solomon campaign was really decided in 2 major naval battles, which were fought off Guadalcanal and on the nights of November 12th and 13th and November 14th and 15th. In these 2 engagements, the Japanese lost 28 warships and transports, a price which discouraged them from any further large-scale attempts to regain control of Guadalcanal. For months, the Japanese maintained small garrisons on Guadalcanal and other islands in the Solomon Group, but American control of the sea blocked their supply lines and brought about the eventual defeat. From Buna on the northeast coast of New Guinea, which the Japanese had taken earlier that year, the enemy began to drive towards Port Moresby on September 9th, 1942. This was the beginning of a bitter campaign for control of the island. The Japanese were finally stopped at the Owen Stanley Mountain Range by American and Australians under General Douglas MacArthur. As Allied air strength increased, the Japanese were pushed back to their bases on the Bismarck Sea. Victory in Tunisia. During the winter of 1943, Allied progress in Tunisia was at a standstill. Axis reinforcement from Sicily and a muddy terrain contributed equally to the stalemate. But in mid-April, the British 8th Army struck in the south and American and British 1st Army forces advancing in the north and west. Simultaneously on May 7th, American troops captured Bitzeriti and the British took Tunis. The conquest of the area left open only the Cape Bon Peninsula, into which the 8th Army drove the remaining Germans and Italian troops. On May 12th, all resistance in Tunisia had ended, and The Allies held 252,415 prisoners and a large amount of equipment. The Tunisian campaign was followed by the conquest of Sicily on the south coast, of which the initial American and British beachheads were established on July 10th. The invading force was composed of the Americans' 7th Army and the battle-hardened British 8th. The Americans moved north and west, while the British veterans drove up the east coast. The capital of Palermo was taken on July 23rd by the Americans, who had then turned eastward in direction of Messina, moving slowly against heavy opposition. The British took Catania on August 5th and drove the Axis towards Messina, the evacuation point to the mainland. When the 7th Army took Messina on August 17th, the Sicilian campaign was over. The Aleutians. The summer of 1943 was marked by the American recapture of 2 principal Aleutian islands, which the Japanese had taken in 1942. A strong American naval task force protected the landings of troops on a 2 campaign. What? I feel like I'm missing something. On May 11th. After a minor but bloody campaign, Washington announced on May 30th the end of the Japanese resistance. On August 15th, a well-balanced U.S. fleet arrived off Kiska, only to find the island deserted of Japanese. After the Stalingrad disaster, the German High Command had resorted to defensive warfare. Throughout the long spring, little ground was exchanged by either the Red Army or the Germans. On July 5th, the Germans launched the abortive offensive in the Kursk area. But 2 weeks later, the Russians were pounding them back and took Orel on August 5th. Their big summer success was the recapture of Kharkov on August 23rd. And finally, for this video, air offensive. At the end of the 4th year, the Axis was on the defensive on all fronts. In addition to the pressure on the Russians, Mediterranean and Pacific areas, German key cities were being subjected to a terrific round-the-clock bombing by British and American planes from English bases. Allied strategists were confident that this continual hammering, with its toll of German production, would provide an adequate temporary substitute for the Western Front action demanded by the Soviets. Yeah, so the 4th year, very important. This is basically the beginning of the end. The end's been coming. It's just been slow, but yep, this is where all of that, where the ball starts rolling down the hill a lot faster, gaining a lot more speed. And by the end of this year, the Germans are almost basically defeated. Obviously, we'll have to wait till the next year, 1945. But, yeah, the Germans will soon be no more, and then the Japanese will follow not long after. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a comment. Tell me what I could improve on. I always appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.